Hello, welcome everybody. I am Chris Herbert. I'm the Managing Director of the Joint Center for Housing Studies. It's my great pleasure to welcome you tonight to our discussion of This Is All I Got, A New Mother's Search for Home, a new book published last year by Lauren Sandler, a journalist who has written in numerous publications, been worked at NPR and Slate as the author of several books, and has most recently completed this book she'll be sharing with us tonight. We'll start with having Lauren share a bit of observations from the book, and then we'll open it up to a conversation with some panelists who I'll introduce at that point. Just as an introduction, I want to say just how important stories like this, these narratives of individuals and their struggles and challenges in navigating social supports and our market economy are. I just came from a session with Marshall Gans from the Kennedy School, who talks about the power of narrative. And too often, organizations like mine are focused on data to tell a story. But in fact, we're human beings and we really respond to the heart as much as the head. And so hearing stories like Camila's that Lauren will share with us tonight is just so important to increase our understanding and our empathy with people in these conditions. So really excited to have Lauren here and to have a chance to have a conversation about the important issues she raises in this book. So Lauren, without anything further, let me turn it over to you to share your story of Camila. You're on mute, Lauren.
We have a little theme here with me being mute. Anyway, hi everyone. Thank you, Chris, and thank you everyone for joining us. I love that you began with that point about how we so often think in terms of data with these issues. That's exactly why I wrote the book. Because in journalism too, we so often think in data and not actual stories that we get to inhabit, that we get to do what literature allows us to do, which is enter the keyhole of a larger experience through something very unique, which is an individual's life. The reason that I initially came to this topic was something out of just a deep feeling for me. When I moved to New York in 1992, there were 20,000 people sleeping every night in city shelters, and it was treated like an epidemic of massive proportions, a crisis. There was between 1 and 2 stories in the New York Times about the crisis of homelessness every day. And then flash forward to 2015, when I was reporting this book, there were 60,000 people sleeping in New York City shelters and another many thousand more on the streets or sleeping elsewhere in private shelters like the one where I met Camila. And there was very little reporting at all. And in fact, the reporting that exists tends to be more data driven. It's hard and expensive to do immersion reporting. It's not where my field is putting its resources. It's, constantly diminishing resources these days. So I decided I needed to do it myself. Which is not some act of hardship. I got to come back to my nice home in Brooklyn every night and have my own secure, privileged existence. And the book really does wrestle with that aspect of things too, what it means to be a person of privilege, not just reporting on a life that is so much less privileged, but what it even just means to share a society, to share a culture, to share love, as I came to with someone who doesn't have those opportunities. So anyway, I found a shelter that would let me report. It was a private shelter. City shelters do not let reporters in, which is a whole other issue. And I started spending time with 4 different women. Some of them were more demographically aligned with a classic case, which tends to be an African-American woman, a single mother. What we deal with in family homelessness is, of course, an epidemic that is really principally concentrated on women of color, at least in urban areas. Within the 4 women I was spending time with, one of them emerged as particularly interesting to me, though, and she was not that mean. She was Dominican, is Dominican instead of African-American. She's someone who was a criminal justice student in school. And there was no history of addiction in her past, in her family. And she had this ability to navigate the system that like blew every social worker away. This incredible legal mind. I mean, she could work out paperwork that would make me dizzy. She could figure out how to find resources where no one else seemed to. And I thought if she couldn't make it work, I couldn't imagine anyone else in her situation who possibly could. So I wanted to find out if she could. And also, I mean, a lot of people think that choosing a subject is, as though you get to sort of pluck anyone you want out of the ether. It's of course a matter of great trust and great intimacy. She chose me as much easily as I chose her. She gave me this incredible privilege of opening the door to her life and letting me walk through completely with no strings attached. Also something I write about. Anyway, the book begins with Camila going into labor in her shelter in Brooklyn, which by the end of the book, she reflects upon that period of time in that shelter, pregnant or with a newborn, as the good old days. It is not a book with a happy ending. Or at least I don't think so. Other readers may see it in other ways. But this year that I write about, it's written as a nonfiction novel, essentially, something that I want the reader to feel and to see that panhandlers, men on the street, are not the only homeless people out there. In fact, there are people who we sit next to on the bus, on the subway all the time, who are homeless mothers, but we don't see them because they don't look homeless, with big air quotes. Camila and I would go shopping at H&M. She put on makeup much better than I do. She's not anyone who you would see on the subway and assume this is her life. And there are, of course, many, many thousands of women like her. So I wanted people to be able to not just see and feel the crisis of homelessness as a silo through her story, not just as a housing story, but to understand the entire constellation of factors that could leave this extraordinary woman in these extraordinarily impossible circumstances that no matter what she did, she could not find her way out of. Those, I think that we often think about things in terms of silos, not just in the academy, not just in the social services world, but also in journalism. We have beats. So we think in terms of race or gender or family issues or real estate development or welfare. And her story is one that really braids together all of these different factors into a rope that is really attached to an anchor. It's an impossible combination of things. But what any of the women in the shelter would tell you, and what they told me many times, is that in a pyramid, if we could imagine this, of different crises that each one of them was really burdened by, and they all continue to be, the foremost crisis, the foundation, was their homelessness, was their inability to secure stable housing, that without that, nothing else was possible. And that has struck me as such a tragedy, as such a human rights crisis, because out of all of these different factors braided together, it really seems to me to be the most solvable crisis, and certainly the most urgent one. So this book is a book that I reported before the pandemic. It came out in the spring, just as everything was falling apart in terms of the pandemic. And people seem to be shocked at the time of the state of poverty that was so common already in our city, as people were being told to not leave their homes, what it meant to not have a home to leave. There are a lot of people who thought that the idea of sheltering in place when you have no shelter was a nice way to sort of wrap things up. And it seemed like there was a moment that we were all going to really feel this in a different way. In 2015, when I was reporting, I was very much writing this book so that I could shake people by the lapels and get them to pay attention to this crisis. And it seemed like the book was emerging in a moment when the world was finally paying attention. And now, all these months later, the book came out in April, it feels like that attention has very much dissipated for plenty of decent reasons. It's been a really hard year for everyone, no matter who. But this moment that felt like, okay, maybe we will build back better. Maybe this is something that we will finally in our culture feel the urgency to solve the crisis of homelessness and all of the other factors that might be related to it. I feel that urgency has just vanished. And that's part of why I am so glad to be part of this conversation with these other remarkable panelists, and so glad to speak to you all.
Thank you, Lauren, so much. And I don't want to share your pessimism. I want to share your hope that, in fact, the conversation is continuing and that there is a different recognition of these issues now. And it may take time for those responses to come, but hopefully they will. And hopefully this conversation and your book will help to do that. Let me now introduce the two other folks we have here to discuss Lauren's book and these issues with us. Julie Boatright Wilson, the Harry S. Kahn Senior Lecturer in Social Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, and Raysa Rodriguez, Associate Executive Director for Policy Advocacy at the Citizens Committee for Children of New York. Welcome to you both. Thank you for being with us. Let me start with a question. And Julie and Raysa, you can turn on your cameras now and unmute. I'll start with a question for Raysa. As I said at the outset, I think it is important for us to have stories of people to help us relate and understand. It provides a lot more nuance and context, but it is one story. So Raysa, let me start with you and your work. How do you see the story of Camila resonating with the families that you work with in the city? How common is this, or how distinct are some of the other problems that aren't captured in this book?
Thank you so much, Chris, for having me. And thank you, Lauren, for sharing so generously your experience in writing this book. I think you're absolutely right. It's important to tell these stories. I'm Raysa Rodriguez. I head up Policy and Advocacy at Citizens Committee for Children. We are a lead organization in the Family Homelessness Coalition, which is a coalition of diverse nonprofits and advocates and service providers. And our goal is to really do so much of what Lauren tries to describe in her opening statements, is really called attention to the urgency of homelessness crisis. I think you were spot on, Lauren, in suggesting that oftentimes when we think about homelessness, we think of the panhandler, we think of a single adult without shelter. But in New York, homelessness is very much a crisis that affects women, single mothers, and also children. In terms of, again, I know our goal is to really highlight, real stories of how these issues impact families and children. And I encourage you all to look at Family Homelessness Coalition. We've done some work there in also shedding light on the experiences of brave women who have lived experiences with homelessness. But in terms of the numbers and what the data tells us, I couldn't help but, feel huge concern, Lauren, when you talked about the history, right, in terms of what you saw in the early 90s and 2015, we're at the spike. We've made some progress, but the fact is that there's still too many families facing housing insecurity for a prolonged period of time. Even before the pandemic, we were concerned about a homelessness crisis that affected families with children. We had more than 40,000 individuals in the system. When you look at shelter, nearly 70% of those who are in shelter are actually families with young children. And then what I always find it important to say is that when you look at the amount of time that families are spending in shelter, on average, we're talking well over a year, right? And when you think about the life of a child, that's a significant amount of time where we know the science tells us how important those first years of life are. And the majority of children growing up in the shelter system are young children. And so I think it's important to note again that the issue of homelessness impacts families significantly, that this is very much a race equity issue. 95% of families that are in the shelter system are Black or Hispanic. That is not a mistake. That is due to systemic inequities, right? that overwhelmingly disproportionately impacts families of color. Also, it's important to note that more than 2/3 of families who are in shelter are also headed by a single mother. And so, we are seeing the consequences, if you will, of lack of investments and also inequity in our systems that result in too many children facing housing insecurity.
Thank you, Raysa. I don't know, Julie, if you had more to add on that, you having worked in this field yourself a long time.
Not to the numbers. I think the numbers are devastating. And I think Raysa's point about a year in the life of a child is really very different than the year in the life of an older adult in terms of their development, the importance of the connections with people, their place in school. It's just devastating to a whole generation.
Well, I know a subject you do know a bit about is the social welfare system itself. And so, I mean, one of the things that's striking about this book is two things. One thing, in some ways, the system is fairly generous in the sense that she has access to childcare benefits, support for education, and others. But you have to go through to be able to find your way through that system. And as Lauren describes, and this young woman is amazing in her ability to navigate both being a mother and traveling around the city in wicket lines. Is this Byzantine system that we see in this, how typical is that, or how much does that reflect really the nature of our social welfare system, Julie?
I think it's relatively reflective. It's a little bit more complicated in New York City than in other places, but I think it's very reflective. One of the sayings we have among those of us who study this is never confuse poverty with stupidity. You can't afford to be poor unless you're really smart and can negotiate the systems. I think there are two important things to remember. What about our system? One is that it's incredibly fragmented, our social service system. And the second is that it's really conflicted. So let me start with a fragmented piece. If you read about the history of social services in the US, you sort of see, well, they started locally because people would know who really needed help. They could provide them in-kind help, and they would know who was a stranger who didn't belong there, and they could send them off. And gradually, larger geographic areas, counties began to take this over and run these sort of social services systems. But the second key point about the fragmentation is, as people discovered new needs, they developed a whole new social service system for them. And sometimes the needs were, oh, these families need some funding to get through this month. They don't have any food. Oh, then, by the way, we have a lot of surplus agriculture products. Why don't we just give those to the people who are hungry? A bag of beans and cheese and some things like that. Then we discovered early childhood, and we thought about childcare. And as we kept discovering more needs and more strategies to address them, we kind of tacked on more social services, and each one is independent. And so if you combine this real complex set of social services, each one focused on a specific need, and the fact that they're geographically based, someone has to figure out how you negotiate this. There are some communities, Massachusetts is experimenting with one-stop shop, as they call it, where you go in and you can talk to a lot of people and get services met. Now, there's still a lot of different programs. They're trying to negotiate the programs. New York City is more complicated than most because since these services are often managed and run and funded on a geographic basis, usually on a county basis, New York City is 5 counties. So I was struck by the fact the number of times she was on the subway going from the Bronx to Queens to Manhattan. You think about county courthouses in Massachusetts, but when you're in Boston, there's a city court system. That's not New York. So I think in that respect, New York is much more complicated than other places. The second thing I would point out about the social service system is the idea that it's conflicted. And for generations, we've been trying to sort out the deserving from the undeserving poor and saying, oh, we could help the deserving poor. The widow whose husband died in the Civil War and was left with 2 children, let's take care of her. Oh, you're a single mom. Your husband didn't die, you just never got married. Well, there are some other issues there. We don't feel quite as comfortable. Are we incentivizing more women to have children without getting married? And so you see throughout the history of the US, and whenever, even today in Congress, as they debate these things, this tension between when are you incentivizing people to engage in behavior that is not productive by my definition of productive, and when are you actually supporting people? And the dilemma of how do you support children without incentivizing mothers, I think, has created a lot of challenges in terms of structuring social services. And then the third point I would make is that those who are working on the front lines, they are seeing, think about how many hundreds of people they're seeing in any given day. Everyone has a story, like the protagonist in this novel. These people probably have their own history of trauma and their own poverty. That's why they're on the front lines. They're working with trying to figure out these arcane rules about eligibility. And by the way, my computer that deals with this program actually doesn't talk to the system that deals with food stamps, that deals with childcare. I can't help you. And in the face of seeing people who really need this and not being able to help them, you can see how they might steel themselves to respond when it's just one person after another coming to them for help.
Yeah, Lauren, that's a really interesting observation, Julie, because it is, I mean, those folks in the front lines are probably some of the least sympathetic folks in the book, Lauren, but I'm just curious, so your reaction.
I mean, just to add to that, they may be some of the least sympathetic,
but some of the most.
but they also are it's an entire workforce of underpaid people of color who are, it's not a good work environment. It's not a good paycheck. It's, they are also trapped in the system, just on the other side of the desk. And I do want to note that, but I also want to add a fourth point to everything that Julie just schooled us in. And I so appreciate everything that you said, which was, I have this memory of, I was visiting my sister-in-law in Berkeley where she lives. And I was telling her this story about how one of the women at the shelter who had a law degree from Russia had lost her entire welfare case. And she couldn't figure out why. And they sent her all this documentation. I spent hours with her looking at this documentation. And between the two of us, her law degree, my master's degree, other people piping in to try to figure things out. It took us about 3 hours to figure out from one envelope of paperwork that it was because her employer in her home health care job overpaid her $20. So she lost childcare, she lost, her $220 a week. She lost whatever was going to maybe even keep her in the shelter because she needed to have an open case to be in the shelter. And she went back to the office with pneumonia 3 times with her kid before any of this could be resolved. And I was telling my sister-in-law this story, and she happened to have a book on the table that she pushed across the table to me. And it was the book Administrative Burden by Pamela Hurd and Donald Moynihan at Georgetown. And it was one of those moments where this huge obtuse thing that I didn't have a name for suddenly had a name. This concept of administrative burden, where the system is intentionally obtuse, where the system is intentionally Byzantine, because who has the patience or time or stamina to make it through any of that? There's so many women I met who needed benefits desperately, but what it took to get them was just impossible. It was incompatible with having, mental health, with having a job, with taking care of a kid. And that is something that to me is part of this crisis.
Raysa, you work with the system a lot in your job. Anything further you'd add or your observations on this?
Or I think, what we're talking about is really inefficiencies, right? One of our goals is to figure out a couple of things. So the first, there's a need for greater investments for sure, right? Because we know, particularly during the times that we're working through now, that the needs are so much more deep. Having said that, we're all cognizant and recognize the fiscal climate that we're in, and there are things that we can do to bring about greater efficiencies in the system, right? And so looking at ways to streamline access to services, expanding eligibility, there are low cost, smart ways to bring about greater supports, right? And one example that comes to mind is, in the issue of rent assistance, we've gotten some relief from the federal government to be able to provide rent assistance, but the requirements are so stringent, they're so strict, and do not allow for necessary flexibility that oftentimes what's at risk is leaving dollars at the table. So as an example, placing a requirement that there needs to be an eviction proceeding in order to draw down subsidies, right? That makes sense, right? But during these circumstances, right, there is actually a moratorium in place, right? And so that inhibits and allows for an incredible amount of inefficient barriers to what can be meaningful supports. So I think broadly, systems need to constantly, in an ongoing way, look at ways to bring about efficiencies, but also to coordinate and to share information across agencies and systems.
Go ahead, Julie.
I would just like to add one additional thing. Even where organizations are more effective at getting service providers to work together, there's a challenge in the background that's unspoken, and that is child protective services. We've created a child welfare system where the child welfare agency doesn't go out and look for families who need support and provide them support. They respond to calls that come in on their hotline. And so someone can get angry with you and say, if you don't do what I say, I'm going to report your child to child welfare, in which case there's an investigation and the parent is at risk of losing the child. And what we found in recent research is that very often women with children are reluctant to even reach out to those services that might support them out of fear that someone will report them to child welfare and they'll lose their children.
What I was going to say is that there's that old adage that I think people at the Kennedy School throw around, which is every system, you look at it and say it's broken, but no, every system is perfectly designed to produce the outcome it's producing. And the system we have, to Julie's point, I think, is designed to minimize cheats and to be punitive, to make sure that people have incentives to work. And yet we're surprised when it doesn't work to help people achieve their goals. I mean, I think reading the story of Camila as this smart, woman with ambitions, and clearly, I mean, she makes the honor roll in this community college, despite all the things she's juggling. And you just want a system that's going to support her in making those steps, and not be a system that's designed to make sure she's not cheating.
I think if I can just jump in, because I think it's so important to emphasize, Chris, what we're really pointing to is the need for really deliberate prevention early on, right? I think both in
prevention of what, Raysa, particularly?
Prevention of risk on a multiple level, right? And various issues. So the child welfare example, while separate, right, and comes with its own unique issues, also really important to focus on prevention earlier on than a crisis. In the issue of homelessness, how do we support families and individuals and women like Camila and others who, are trying their best to make ends meet, often 2 or 3 jobs, and still unable to provide the necessary prevention, whether it's childcare, whether it's employment supports, right? Whether it's tax credits that allow for greater resources. I think that, what we need to broaden the discussion is around the wide range of preventive supports that are necessary much earlier on before a crisis.
Yeah, Lauren.
And that also is the sort of multi-generational issue that you were talking about before. So just as a narrative example, Camila's mother was a single mother with 4 children, and a whole slate of issues. But she had Section 8. She had the ability to pay rent in an apartment for all the years that her landlord would accept it. At some point, he decides that he doesn't anymore, and they end up in a shelter. But she was able to raise her kids in Corona, Queens, with, around the corner from their regular school, in their community. They could have stability. And that is a radically different experience than I have been watching Camila have with her own child, because she doesn't have the ability to have that sort of housing subsidy. And because of that, the whole avalanche of different crises that would have been prevented with that element of stability is now what defines her life, and now through these crucial developmental years, what defines her son's life. And I think that these are exponential issues, and they are really preventable ones.
Yeah, the whole housing first movement, which is that before you can address any other challenges people face in their lives, you have to make sure they're stably, securely housed. And that from that, that's the foundation for which other things can be addressed. But if you don't take care of that job, everything else becomes that much more challenging. I wanted to switch gears a little bit. I think it relates to some of the conversation we're having, which is about, Julie raised this notion of the deserving poor, which is, obviously a loaded word. But I think, one of the things about these kind of accounts that you tell of Camila is that, she's a three-dimensional person, and she makes, what some who are not in her shoes might think of as questionable decisions. And so things like, getting an expensive tattoo to celebrate, to take a trip to the Dominican Republic, having a child and dropping out of college. And so, I think Lauren, as someone who knows her so well, what would you say to someone who questions whether or not these were good decisions, whether she might have contributed to the challenges she faces?
One of the things that readers bring up a lot is she would get manicures. And she would make me get manicures. I never got manicures until I started reporting this book. But, if anyone needs a reference for a good salon in Corona, have I got one for you? People would be appalled that she would get regular manicures, as though the $15 that she would spend on her nails could rent her an apartment. Or, for example, there's a lot of people pointed out, yeah, she got this really expensive tattoo as a Christmas present for herself. Her father, who she has this longing for, has 2 total sleeves. She follows all these tattoo artists on Instagram. Like, this is something that she really wanted. And it's something that was really expensive for her. It was several $100s, but several $100s wouldn't even cover the security deposit on an apartment, much less a year's rent. And so one of the things that she and I would talk about a lot is she was completely aware that there is a massive systemic issue here. It's not just a question of scrimping and saving. And I think that this notion that if you're poor, you're a spendthrift. You wouldn't be poor if you didn't get that manicure. You wouldn't be poor if you didn't get that tattoo. It's just a totally bogus way of looking at this, because those little tiny bits of money, which allow a little bit of agency and a little bit of pleasure, in the end would do nothing to change the individual circumstances of any of these people. It's the system that does that. You brought up her trip to the Dominican Republic, which, I mean, it's a bit of a spoiler, I guess. It happens way into the book.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's okay. It's totally relevant. The subtitle of this book is A New Mother's Search for Home. And part of that is she does have this desperate yearning to find a place where she will be taken in as family, where she belongs, where she can feel stable and secure and loved. And as someone who's Dominican American, who has so many friends and relatives who go to the DR all the time, and as someone who has always wanted that experience and felt like there was maybe family that she could connect with in the way that she didn't have here, that becomes this thing that she has up on such a pedestal for really legitimate reasons. And she decides to make a trip to find her father's family. And it was the only moment in all my time with her in which I thought, do I tell her I think that this is a terrible idea? But same thing. I mean, if she spent $3,000 on that trip, that's not going to get her an apartment for a year. And so even in this situation, even in which I was thinking, oh, it's the emergency fund. What happens if your laptop breaks? What happens if Alonzo, your son, gets really sick? All of my paranoia, which isn't just paranoia, these are actual possibilities. It just felt like her longing and her need to take care of herself and find a future for herself was the thing that she needed to decide for herself. And frankly, we allow people her age, she's 22 when she goes to the Dominican Republic, such a margin of error. There's so many different ways that, you know, privileged kids, and I mean privilege with a really wide stretch. I mean, I don't just mean upper middle class kids. I don't just mean people who can afford to really mess up and have daddy bail them out. I mean, people who have radically different experiences of the world. We assume that that's a period of time in which they are going to make mistakes and they will be forgiven, where there is a safety net for them in their own families, in their own cultures. But if you are a poor woman of color who's a single mother and you want to do something in your life that reflects what you see in Instagram or what you know, fantasized about your whole childhood, and now you have the responsibility of taking care of a baby, but you're not supposed to make your own choices about what to do with the money that you've earned. I think that there's a real break there in terms of the very different standards that we have for very different people who are, you know, and that difference is just based on economic and racial privilege in this country. And having these different systems of how you develop as an adolescent, how you develop as a kid, it's just this self-perpetuating thing. And as you can tell, it makes me pretty crazy.
Raysa or Julie, you have anything to add to this, how we think about these choices this young woman makes?
No, the only thing I would add is it's pretty obvious in reading the book that the father of this child has gotten away without contributing anything and is probably making all sorts of choices that if it were known he was a father, people might have different views about, but he's on his own.
Well, we do want to leave time for questions from the audience. And so please do put your questions in the Q&A. We'll be monitoring those and putting them to the panelists. You know, the question of the father, I think, is an interesting one. You know, one thing that's striking about her life is the real lack of loving relationships that I think, you know, reflect the trauma that people in her family and social network are experiencing. And it seems like that lack of loving relationships, but reflective of this broader trauma that this community faces, is also kind of makes her safety net that much more afraid. But this is maybe a bigger question, but what can we do about that, or how important is that? Raysa, you took yourself off mute. Do you have thoughts on this?
Sure, I have a couple of thoughts. I think, you know, you bringing on trauma is so important. When we look at the drivers of family homelessness, you know, affordability, you know, eviction, as well as domestic violence. Domestic violence in recent years has been the #1 driver of family homelessness, and it's been neck and neck with eviction. And so, you know, all that to say is that when you look at the systemic drivers to this issue, it's both economics, but also, you know, social emotional well-being. And so we need to be able to implement solutions that tackle both, right? And this is also still related with the point and the discussions earlier related to individual decisions, right? I think that's such a distraction to what we need to be focusing on, which is solutions. What are the real solutions that are going to make a meaningful difference in increasing housing security? And we know what works, right? Just to give you one quick example, it's all about subsidies. When we look at data, the data is very clear. When families like Camila's and so many others in the system are placed in permanent housing with a rent subsidy, they are much less likely to return to shelter, right? And so investments and a commitment in adequate subsidies are key. And to your issue of trauma, I think it is important to also, yes, ensure that we are delivering services in a client-centered way, that our services, you know, are trauma informed. There's so much literature. If it was a few years out, we would be guessing a bit on in this area. But at this point, the research is very clear about trauma and its impact on children and adults alike. The detriments are lifelong, right? And we know what works in terms of cultivating a trauma-informed environment. And so when we talk about systems change, ensuring that we look at the delivery of services from a client-centered perspective is also an important solution to take into account.
All right, let me take a look at the questions in the Q&A here. So this is a question about what did you learn, Lauren, about the process of working your way out of welfare? Is it possible? Are there any takeaways for people like Camila from what you observed?
So I think that there are different types of work that are different ways to answer this question. So one of the things that people would tell Camila at the welfare office was, you should drop out of school and go pick up cans in the park. And this became a mantra to her, that she should get a city job doing janitorial work in the city. And that way she'd be fine. And we're talking about someone who, you know, was told that the week that she was going to be admitted into John Jay for criminal justice. The notion that that is the fruition of this life and all that she deserves to do and be, which frankly wouldn't even necessarily keep her off welfare, right? I mean, half of fast food workers are also on welfare. We have teachers who are also on welfare. There are jobs out there for some people, but mainly it is a system that is pushing people into work that is not even paid a living wage. And so it's not even necessarily getting people out of the welfare system, it's just getting certain boxes ticked. It's also not suggesting that there are lives of promise, lives that are deserving richness and service. I mean, Camila's work in criminal justice was she wanted to be a social servant. And yet the idea was, you got to drop out of school if you actually want to survive right now. That's not what you do. And she knew that that wasn't surviving, not just thriving, not surviving. And to me, the idea that we tell huge numbers of people in this country, you don't have a right to thrive. You were born into poverty, and therefore you don't have a right to do anything except for, you know, take 3 jobs and live under incredible stress and serve people in subhuman conditions. That to me is not a welfare to work response.
Related to this, there's a question in the Q&A about, well, why is it that we can't seem to create policies that are effective? Is it simple animus to the marginalized that we are designing these policies to fail? Or are there ways in which there's well-meaning intentions, but that we just keep not doing a good job at this? Julie, do you have a sense of why it is that at this point we haven't gotten better at these policies to support folks like this?
If I had that answer, I could actually run for office and maybe do something. I think it's this conflict that we have that's in the back of a lot of people's minds about the deserving and the undeserving poor. It's confounded with race and immigration status, and it's confounded with family composition. And we can sit down and mathematically and statistically talk about what it would take and what we might do, but it's the political will of why should I be why should my taxes be raised to pay for this for you when you could go out there and pick up cans in the park and make yourself better. I think we just have not had the kind of leadership that pulls it all together. I think an interesting study for social scientists would be, What is it like in some of the communities where the community has really tried to, like the city of Cleveland, where they've tried to create some neighborhood networks where a lot of the service providers are coming together and it's a one-stop shop? What do we know about that? What was involved in getting this kind of collaboration? And what does it take to bend the funding streams to let a provider merge funding from different individual programs? It's a real complicated problem. It takes both the political will and it takes as Raysa probably knows better than any of us, all the different funding streams and their regulations. How do you pool those together so that you can create the kind of support and services and individual needs?
There's an interesting observation in the chat talking about trying to develop housing policies and housing supports, and asking, Lauren, from what you saw about the role of landlords. How are you see as landlords as actors in the broader housing stability crisis?
Well, I will say that my reporting was done in a community of people who already found themselves in a shelter. Some of them would tell eviction stories, and they were horrible stories. But I think that I've been thinking about this a lot, especially during the pandemic, during the eviction moratorium, knowing that there are people who, who are not necessarily wealthy developers, who are landlords, who may, have a home where they rent out a single apartment and that's what allows them to pay their mortgage. And now they can't collect rent. I have sympathy in that situation. I think that increasingly though, we have very few small landlords. What we have are massive developers. And we have massive developers who are trying to gouge the system by any means necessary. I remember hearing something at the beginning of the pandemic by a man who runs a homelessness organization in Seattle, Daniel, and I'm flaking on his last name. But it was during the time that hand sanitizer was really hard to find, and people were spending a fortune online for bottles of hand sanitizer, and people were outraged that, you could hear people in the news outraged. And he said, isn't it amazing? Because this is exactly how the housing market works. And people are outraged about hand sanitizer, but not about this, winner takes all, highest bidder way of thinking about housing, which is a human right. And I think that that is the larger issue, that housing has become more and more corporate, more and more designed to house the rich and no one else, or the aspiring rich and no one else. And it hasn't been sustainable. And so those are the landlords I really think about.
There's another question about Biden's proposal for a $15 an hour minimum wage. And I guess maybe Raysa, I'd ask you this question. So the question is does this seem like an effective strategy? Would a higher minimum wage be an important component of an improved policy landscape?
Absolutely. I think, there are certain models that are further developed. I think minimum wage is an important part of the solutions. Rent assistance, again, I know I sound like a broken record, but the more we can invest in rent subsidies, the better we will be at mitigating housing instability, as well as child allowances. There's some important provisions there. It would be great for them to be, larger amounts and more permanent, but to the extent that we can get more cash in families with children's hands, the more we will be able to, get out of this crisis.
Lauren, there in the chat too is the inevitable question that about, so where is she now, what she's doing?
Camila and I have a deal where I don't talk about her now, where when the book ends, that's her life that becomes private after that, which I really need to respect, as much as it is a challenge at times. So I can't tell you. Can I add one thing though to what Raysa just said about minimum wage, which I've been thinking about during this whole conversation, and not to sound like I'm sitting in my mittens scowling on the inauguration platform, but during the past 20 years, we've been really, really comfortable allowing billionaires to go from having a few $1 billion to, you know, well over $100 billion. And that hasn't ruffled any feathers at all. I mean, the chasm in our inequality has become more dystopian all the time. And everyone seems to be incredibly comfortable watching the people who have the most get more and more and more and more. But the idea that any of that could be pulled back to the actual workers who make our world run, that just feels impossible to me. That we can consider something like a living wage to be so unimaginable, while we consider, you know, Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg and the rest of their crew and their gazillion dollars to be something that we just accept as a basic element of life in America.
There are a couple of questions related to policies around homelessness. One of them was about what best practices should Chicago be considering to address homelessness. Another broader question is about what do we know about the effectiveness of housing first policies. So maybe Raysa can start with you in terms of these questions about what kind of policies do we need to address homelessness effectively? What would you recommend?
Thank you, Chris. So to add on to the points I've been making already on rent assistance, I think the housing first model definitely is a worthwhile and effective approach. It's worked better in different places. So in a place like New York City, where real estate is such a commodity, that is a real challenge, right? And we also have a right to shelter where anyone who needs shelter cannot be denied shelter. And so in the New York example, it's been a bit more tough, and it's about, you know, again, improving conditions in shelter when shelter is unavoidable, ensuring that we have prevention in place to avoid shelter when possible, and expanding the pipeline for affordable units. That's by preserving what affordable units we have now. And for new construction of affordable units, you know, going back to this issue of the housing market and how essentially it is a business. One of the things that we've been able to do in New York through strong and coordinated advocacy is ensure that there are, you know, a number of affordable units set aside in any affordable housing project that receives local dollars, right? And so it's policies like that that really prioritize housing and stability for families with children that really make a difference.
That was actually kind of a heart-wrenching part of the story too, where Camila is actually savvy enough to know how to apply to all these lotteries for all these inclusionary zoning developments, essentially finally wins the lottery, but then can't, she applied with her partner and he was no longer her partner and she was no longer eligible. But I mean, Lauren, I don't know if you could put any further color on the kind of her trying to navigate that part of the system to find housing.
Yeah, I mean, you know, in de Blasio's New York, there have been a number of programs put into place which are intended to address some of these issues. Unfortunately, though, you know, the number of places in the affordable housing lotteries are minuscule compared to the need. I mean, like, we're talking tens of thousands of people for every single apartment that might be available. And then if your number comes up, if you're one of the very lucky few, and by the way, I just need to pause for a second. We're a society that thinks that we can have a lottery for affordable housing. I mean, there's just something so dark and cruel about this. But okay, let's say yours is the one out of 20,000 that comes up for the 1-bedroom apartment. that you want to raise your son in, you still need to make a minimum amount of money in order to pay for that rent. And if you are on welfare, you aren't getting anywhere close to that amount of money. And if you are starting to earn something that gets closer to that amount of money, then you're kicked off welfare. Then you lose your childcare benefits. Then you can't get to work. Or let's say, like Camila, you've applied with a partner 3 years ago and you're not in that relationship anymore. You need to provide a certificate of death or divorce if you still want that apartment. So when you start thinking about what Raysa was saying before in terms of eviction and domestic violence, think about how hard it is to keep a relationship together. It's sort of unimaginable to me. And eviction and domestic violence are two elements of life during coronavirus that have both been going up, 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 up. And so the idea that you have to stay together with a partner who might be an abuser, or you may have found yourself in a situation which is different than the one that you applied in, it doesn't matter. You're gone. It's up to the next person on the list to now have to clear these hurdles. And so it sounds really great to have affordable housing if you just refer to it as affordable housing. But when you see how that is actually lived as a process, I mean, it'll just make your mind explode. And of course, this is one of the reasons I wrote this book, is so that affordable housing isn't just something which is called affordable housing in the newspaper, but you go through this process and you feel it almost like a suspense novel of when your number's going to come up and what's going to happen, and all of that hope, all those dreams deferred over and over and over.
So Julie, you want to get in on?
Yeah, I think there is a real dilemma between fairness and problem solving. A number of years ago, Malcolm Gladwell wrote an article for the New Yorker in which he argued that when you look at the homeless population, it's not distributed like a bell curve, like a normal distribution. It's much more like a power distribution. There are some people who are drug addicts, who have mental health problems, who are going to be living under the bridges for a really long time, who are resistant to a lot of what's going on, who have criminal records. But there are a lot of people who just recently became homeless. Why should we make them wait until they then lose jobs and everything else if there are ways to rehouse them rapidly? I think so. One of the things we often do in social services, or we're often unwilling to segment our population and say, oh, we could get this group back in housing right away. Let's do that. Because it's not fair. There are these other people who have been out of housing for longer. Madison Avenue, creating advertising, has no problem segmenting the population and targeting certain groups. There's some lessons there that we should learn. And I think a second thought on this is New York City is in many ways a unique housing market just because of its size. But there's enormous variation in housing markets across the country. And there are a lot of different strategies out there, like sharing a home with an elderly person who can no longer maybe take care of the home but doesn't want to move. Can you create that match? That's not going to happen in New York City, but it might happen someplace else. Lauren will correct me on the New York City.
And there are even ads on the subway for it. Anyway,
okay.
I don't know how effective it is here, but it doesn't.
Yeah, but it's sort of thinking about how do we think about categories of population? How do we think about who we can house really quickly and reduce the big part of the problem, and then really focus on those who are truly, truly challenging, like $1 Million Murray, who was the focus of Gladwell's article. I'll send you a copy of the article, Chris. Maybe you could figure out how to post it.
Sure, we can do that. And I think, Julie, I mean, what that highlights for me is just that we're in this position where we have to try to triage because we don't have enough resources. And so really what one would hope is that we put enough resources to solve all these issues. But in a world of scarcity, what do we do? And we do live in a world. How
do you make decisions? Yeah, about who gets.
We're at the top of the hour. I want to give each of you kind of a last word here, in either something you want to underline that we've talked about, something that hasn't come up, but just last observations, and Lauren, as the author, I'll give you the last word, but Raysa, I'll start with you. Any last thoughts, reactions that you want to leave us with?
Sure, thank you. Thank you again for having me. You know, I would end on the note of, again, of figuring out how our systems could be much more preventive in nature than reactive. And one thing that I will leave as well is the need to focus on children, right? We didn't talk too much about the needs of children that are living in shelter or in other fragile housing situations. And that's maybe that's the subject for our next panel, because there's a lot to discuss there as well.
Great point. Thank you. Julie.
I don't really have much to add other than to say we need to step back and start talking to people who aren't in the field of homelessness, but who think about solving other problems, to see if they can come in with clean ideas without the kind of baggage that those of us who've been involved in this for a while carry, and say, why not try this? Why not try that? And we just have to have the courage to try some of these things and the resources to do it. It's not just courage.
All right, Lauren, last word.
Returning to the idea of the undeserving poor, I've been thinking through this conversation about how we've talked about how extraordinary Camila is in so many ways, how brilliant and experienced she is. And Julie's mentioning the, people who are drug addicts and deal with severe mental illness. I want to point out that I don't think that they are any more or less deserving. They just happen to not be the center of my book. And I don't think that Julie was suggesting that, but I think it's really incumbent upon us as not just people who think about policy and data, but also other human beings, to try to enter those stories, the whole range of stories of humanity. Which we do about tons of different demographics of people. This is a demographic of people who have rich inner lives and hopes and dreams and remarkable struggles and high stakes. And we need to have their stories be a part of our culture as much as anything else.
I agree. I was not suggesting we ignore the others. You're absolutely right. We need to pay more attention and hear the stories. And so thank you for your story.
Yeah, echoing Julie, thank you for your story, because as I said in the introduction, I think as human beings, we need to have speak to our heart. And ultimately, I think what we need is a set of policies that are more compassion based than they are, punitive based or rules based. And I think by hearing the story of Camila as a three-dimensional human being with hopes and dreams and maybe some failings like all of us, it's important to think about how do we make her have an opportunity to succeed. And I think as a member of our society, our community, we have an obligation to do that. Lauren, you said that from the COVID pandemic, maybe there was an opening to get more done. I'm still hopeful that's true, and I hope that this conversation helps to highlight it for folks who are in position to do that, including all of us here and those listening. For those of you who participated, thank you. I'm sorry we didn't get to all your Q&A. It's such a difficult process to try to manage that, but I appreciate all of our speakers today for being with us, and I wish you well, and we'll see you next time.